So, have you ever wondered what really makes Donald Trump tick? I mean, not just the politics, but the psychology behind it all? Today, we're cracking open a really fascinating book, Inside the Leader's Mind, which presents this deep psychological analysis of him, framing it as, believe it or not, a user manual.
And that line, right at the start, it's not just some clever hook. It's the whole idea behind the book. The author, Chris Dobias, basically argues that if you want to understand a complex system, you don't stand there and judge it. No, you read the manual, you figure out how it operates, what happens when you push certain buttons, and you learn what to expect.
So what does that actually mean in practice? Well, it means we have to completely shift our approach. The book argues that for years, the way we've tried to understand Trump has been, well, fundamentally flawed. We've been busy trying to critique a person when, according to this analysis, we should have been documenting a system.
The book's central claim is that our usual methods just haven't worked. It argues that moral outrage, even fact-checking, after 30,000 documented false claims and a 34-count felony conviction, have all proven to be strategically useless. So instead of all that critique, the author proposes something different, recognizing deep-seated patterns, doing a kind of psychological archaeology, and just documenting the system for what it is.
So what's the framework for this so-called user manual? Well, the book lays out a pretty clear four-layer model. It's designed to build a complete psychological profile, basically from the ground up. It's a really logical progression when you think about it. It starts with what it calls the formative wounds of childhood. From there, it maps out the psychological defenses that were built to protect those wounds. Those defenses then reveal these recurring behavioral patterns in adulthood. And the whole point, the ultimate goal, is to use those patterns to predict future behavior.
All right, let's go back to the beginning of the story, to what the book calls the source code. The analysis argues that, to understand the program, you first have to understand how it was originally written way back in those formative years of childhood.
The entire model in this book is built on a foundation of a few very specific documented events from Trump's early life. And these aren't just presented as interesting biographical details. They're framed as the core programming that has been running his entire life.
The book really zooms in on three key events. First, when he was just 2.5, his mother was hospitalized for up to a year. This, the book argues, created a profound wound of abandonment. Then, this was followed by constant pressure from his father, Fred Trump, to be a killer, to suppress any and all weakness. And finally, at age 13, he was exiled to military academy. The book says this didn't reform him, but just institutionalized the lesson he'd already learned. Dominate, or you will be dominated.
And this quote right here, it illustrates just how deep that psychological impact goes. For a toddler, a mother's sudden absence isn't some abstract thing. The book argues it's a terrifying reality that can fundamentally corrupt a child's internal operating system, teaching them that needing someone is dangerous and that the world is, at its core, an unsafe place.
Okay, so if those wounds are the source code, then what kind of operating system do they create? Well, the book identifies a set of rigid, really predictable, and interlocking behavioral patterns that it says have been documented for decades.
The first one is what the book calls the dominance machine. This is the core function. It's a system where every single interaction, whether it's a business deal, a political debate, or just a casual conversation, is processed as a zero-sum battle for supremacy. And, according to the book, this isn't a choice, it's a psychological necessity for survival.
We've all heard this line, right? I alone can fix it. The book uses this as a prime example of that dominance machine in action. The statement isn't just seen as political grandstanding. It's presented as the perfect expression of an operating system that just cannot conceive of collaboration, only of singular dominant control.
The second pattern is something the book calls the vengeance algorithm. This is described as a sort of computational process that's just running constantly in the background. Any perceived slight, no matter how tiny, gets logged. It then demands disproportionate revenge. And here's the kicker. There's no statute of limitations. The algorithm can wait years, even decades, to execute.
And finally, there's the loyalty trap. This is the pattern that the book says defines his relationships. It's a demand for absolute, unquestioning, one-way loyalty. But because the relationship is purely transactional, the book argues, it always ends the same way. Once a subordinate is no longer useful, they get discarded. A pattern the book calls narcissistic discard, where people are just disposed of once their utility is gone. And look, these aren't just abstract ideas. The book points to over $443 million in court-ordered penalties from civil fraud and defamation cases as a concrete, measurable output of this operating system. It's what happens when these psychological patterns repeatedly clash with legal and social norms.
So, this brings us to the ultimate purpose of this whole user manual idea. The book argues that this model isn't just about explaining the past, its real value lies in predicting the future.
So why does any of this matter? Well, according to the author, if you can truly understand the system's programming, its behavior stops being so surprising. In fact, it becomes predictable.
The book's entire analysis leads to one pretty stark conclusion. The core programming that was installed in childhood, it's fixed. The patterns that come from it are immutable, and therefore, future behavior can be reliably anticipated because the system itself cannot and will not change.
This quote from the book really drives that point home. The analysis suggests that hoping for growth or change or moderation is basically futile. The psychological structures are just too rigid. The system is going to continue to run its program no matter what the circumstances are.
And that leaves us with the book's final, pretty provocative thought. The goal of this kind of psychological deep dive isn't to forgive or to justify behavior. No, it's to provide a predictive tool. By understanding the user manual, the book argues, we can anticipate the system's next move. And the final question it leaves us with is this. Now that we've read the manual, what do we do with that knowledge?